morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Great to be with you tonight, and I'm going to share my passion for the mind-brain connection with you, and hopefully you'll feel very empowered and hopeful once I'm done. So I am a clinical neuroscientist and communication pathologist, and 38 years ago, I was sitting in a neurology and neuroscience lecture and was being told by my professors at the time that the brain can't change, or that the brain couldn't change. And in the 80s, that was the going theory. There was a definite understanding of the difference between the mind and the brain, but they didn't believe at that point in history in the 80s that the brain could actually physically change. And this really challenged me. And I remember asking my professors and saying, but how can that be? Because every day we experience something new, every moment we experience something new with our mind, and therefore the brain, which the mind uses, will be changing. So they said, well, that's kind of a ridiculous question, and I've done a TED talk on this. It's called The Ridiculous Question of the Fact that the Mind Can Change the Brain. And they said, well, prove it, do some research. So I started working with people with closed head injuries, traumatic brain injuries, way back then in the 80s. The reason I started my research with traumatic brain injury was because at that time there was very little research on traumatic brain injury because of the going philosophy of the day, which was the brain can't change. So if someone's got a damaged brain, what hope is there? So I started working with people, and some of my early research, I'll tell you one story of one particular patient of mine it was an incredible change. It changed me completely, as did the thousands I worked with since. And this particular person was 16 at the time of her accident, had a terrible car accident, was in a coma for more than 2 weeks. And at that time, the neurologist would tell us, or the going theory of that time, was that if you were in a coma for longer than 8 hours, the brain damage was considered irreversible. So long story short, fast forward, this young girl was basically, her parents told her she was going to be a vegetable. And that is a terrible thing to tell a parent, but these parents never gave up, and they kept on talking to her, believing in her, supporting her, and eventually she did come out of the coma. And she heard, when she was able to verbalize, she said she actually heard the doctors and the nurses and the family in different stages as she was healing. She was able to hear when she was in their coma. 8 months later, it was about 6 to 8 months later, they contacted me. She had gone from being a so-called vegetable to functioning at about a second grade level, which in itself was a miracle. But she wasn't satisfied with this. She wanted to get further. She wanted to get back to her peer group. At this point, her peer group were entering into 12th grade, and she was functioning at a second grade level. This was very early in my research. They approached me. They literally said, please, will you just help me? So I said, well, listen, I am just starting out with psychoneurophysiology, which is the basically mind-brain-body connection. If you want, we can try the system that I'm developing. And we did. 8 months later, not only did this young girl get back to her peer group level, but she finished 12th grade with her peer group level and went on to get a university degree. And what was very interesting as well is that prior to the accident, with no brain damage, she was battling with things like mathematics and so on. She was a very average to poor student. After the accident, with learning how to use her mind to change her brain, she actually became a math genius. And this really started this spurred me on to do years of research. 38 years later, I am still researching, still working in different communities. I am a behavioral researcher, so I go into communities and work directly with people. I don't bring people into a laboratory and create fictitious or create environments that are not real life. I grew up in South Africa and did 25 years of my research in South Africa through the different terrible apartheid, transition, and post-apartheid era. I've worked in Rwanda over the genocide. I've worked in many different places. I've done a lot of work in this country. And I say all that to say that I have learned from doing work in the field that as humans, we have the most powerful mind, and when we use our mind, we change our brain. And so therefore the mind and the brain are not the same thing. The difference between the mind and the brain are incredibly obvious. Although consciousness is considered the hard question of science, I would call it the most obvious question of science, because we're using our mind every single day to make decisions, every single moment, and even when we are asleep, the mind is working. So the difference between someone who's dead and someone who is alive is their mind. The mind is what enables you to process what I'm saying at the moment. The mind is what enables you to wake up in the morning and get dressed and connect with your loved ones and do whatever it is that you do and go through the ups and downs of the day and the ups and downs of life. It is your mind that enables you to process life. It is your mind that enables you to think and feel and choose about life, and your mind shows up in your brain. So your brain is a responder to your mind. And this is incredibly hopeful. So much more hopeful than the view of 38 years ago where they believed that the brain couldn't change. So we've advanced so much in our understanding of what we would call neuroplasticity. Neuro meaning the brain, plastic meaning to change. So therefore, neuroplasticity is when the mind shows up in the brain and the brain changes. A dead person doesn't experience neuroplasticity because the mind is no longer working. So in other words, the mind is the thing that energizes and activates the physical brain and the body. So the mind is something that actually can be managed. So I talk about mind management. And in my 38 years of research across all the different fields and different socioeconomic strata and working with kids in schools and patients with severe traumatic brain injuries and autism and dementias and learning disabilities and severe trauma victims of all different age groups, CEOs of corporations, whatever, across the field, I have seen that the power of the mind to change the brain is real. And the impact of the mind on the brain and the body is real. So the mind-brain-body connection is called psychoneurobiology. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what this is and a little bit of the systems and things that I've developed to try and help people to understand this and to understand what mental health is. And that's become a huge part of the work that I do, because in the 38 years that I've been in the field, and I practiced for 25 years of these 38 years, basically what I have seen is a tremendous ability of humans to be able to intentionally drive how the mind functions, and therefore influence the biology of the brain and the biology of the body. And this connection is powerful and something that we are able to drive. Sure, things happen like traumatic brain injuries, car accidents, tumors in the brain, certain neurological diseases, illnesses, medications, so many things, chemicals will affect the physiology of the brain and the body. But the mind is very powerful in changing how the brain and the body function. So in the 38 years I've been in the field, I have watched the trajectory of mental health change. Mental health has always been kind of mishandled, and it's always been kind of misunderstood as well. And we're now in an era where we are talking about the second pandemic of mental health. Meanwhile, mental health is not anything new. Since the beginning of time, whenever that was, we have all been managing our minds or not managing our minds and changing our brains in response to life. So being a human and being alive means that mental health is in existence. So therefore, mental health challenges are not anything new. People battle with mental health and have been since the beginning of time. So therefore, if you're alive, which you all are here tonight, every single one of us is battling to a certain extent with mental health. And there is absolutely no shame in that. It is such a normal part of being human. But in the 38 years I've been in the field, I have watched the rise and understanding of neuroplasticity, which has been incredibly wonderful. But I have also seen it change how we look at humans. And it's also made us very much, the focus has shifted from you as a person with your narrative in life and the environment that you're experiencing and what you are going through as a human, to that being kind of not looked at as being important and being reduced down to a very neuroreductionistic approach of looking at a person's symptoms. Now, things like emotions are looked at as illnesses. And emotions are not illnesses. Emotions are warning signals. Emotions are collectively how your brain, body, and mind work together to tell you that something is going on in your life. Emotions are an incredible gift that if we know how to tune into them as signals, we can learn to manage our mind and therefore manage our bodies and therefore manage the health of our brain. We can literally drive the neuroplasticity of our brain, and that is a powerful thing. So at any one point in time, we as humans are living in two kind of zones. And those zones are, I'm so short, I'm coming out from behind here, so I can see you. You could see me. Okay, so we are living in a mental mess and a wise mind. So we have a wise mind and we have a messy mind. This is a simple explanation to understand mental health. At any one moment, all of us are operating in both of those. The messy mind is totally acceptable. The messy mind is part of your design. It is part of how we are designed neurophysiologically and the whole psychoneurobiological link. What the messy mind is, it's basically us going through the unexpectedness of life. You wake up in the morning, you don't know what's going to happen. You can predict to a certain extent, and you'll be 50 to 70% accurate, but you are going to have things that are going to happen during the course of the day that are going to throw you potentially. And on average, we kind of cope. So if you think of a little grid, or imagine that I'm holding I've got a big number line in front of me, and it's 0 in the middle, and on this side it goes from 1 to 10, and on this side it goes from -1 to -10. Okay, and in the middle is 0. Now there's a bell curve. Imagine a bell curve going over -4 to 0 to +4. Most of us, on average, an average sort of life, we are living in the -4 to +4 zone. So the -4 example, you maybe wake up in the morning and you didn't sleep well because you didn't go to bed well because you just didn't handle yesterday very well. So you kind of wake up complaining, which by the way causes brain damage. And then you read an email from your boss and that makes you feel even worse. And you get out of bed and then the kids are this and the dog is that and the husband's this and the wife's that and whatever. And then something great happens. So you're going from a -4, 3, whatever. And then suddenly you get this great email or this great text or a great phone call or conversation, and you're at +4, and so you go through the day. And so we manage the ups and downs. But the thing is we can't control the events and circumstances of life. We cannot control those, we cannot control people. But we can control our reactions and our responses. We can turn our reactions into responses. That is what we're able to do. Mental health is all around how we do that. Mental health is giving ourselves permission to be human, to experience the messiness of the unpredictability of life and of our potential unpredictable responses. Because when you are thrown into a situation where you are thrown off guard, your emotions are very strong. And we will often do and say things in that moment that we actually surprise ourselves. But it's a coping mechanism. It is a reaction. And what we want to do is not beat ourselves up about that. What we want to do is recognize these reactions for what they are so we can manage them and turn them into responses. And in that way, we can deal with the unpredictabilities of life. We can have peace in the midst of chaos. We can see things like depression and anxiety not as mental illnesses, but as warning signals that there's something going on in life. Now, sometimes things accumulate because sometimes you're in an abusive marriage or an abusive situation, or you're abused as a child, or you're abused at work, or there's a series of things that just happen in your life. According to scientific research, more or less once every 4 to 5 years, we will go through some major traumas, But every day we are going through minor traumas. And sometimes those minor traumas will accumulate as well. So traumas on a scale from 1 to 10. And you can be in a state of a 10, 10, 10, 10, 10 for a period of time, and then it can shift back into a 1, 2, or 3. A 1, 2, or 3, or 1 would be something like a really bad post on social media, or someone saying something horrible to you that really throws you, or someone yelling at you at work or something. Versus a 10 would be, let's say, sexual abuse as a child, or in a marriage, or in the workplace, or something like that. So being in a war situation, or something like that, grief, loss of a loved one, and so on. So we all experience trauma. As humans, you cannot get away from the fact that you're going to have trauma on a 1 to 10 scale. And at some point in your life, it's going to be closer to the 8, 9, 10. And at some point in your life, it's going to be down. Most of the time, we hover around the 1 to 4 mark. So we need to become trauma-informed as as humans. We need to get human again. We need to give ourselves permission to experience these emotions and not see depression and anxiety and frustration and irritation and overwhelm and burnout, not see all these things as mental illnesses, that there's something wrong with you, that you have a brain disease. That's not what's going on. What's going on is that you are actually experiencing the adverse experiences of life, somewhere on a scale of 1 to 10. And as they accumulate, we can slide down that scale. So as you maybe have a series of 8, 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, 8, 9, 10 over a period of time, instead of staying around the -4, +4 zone, you start shifting down the -5, -6, -7, -8, -9, -10. And that's when we start showing up with very strong warning signals, like very strong mood swings, hallucinations, delusions, hearing voices, the different types of trauma responses, or panic attack, flight, trauma, flight, fawn and freeze, all those different things, because it is your mind trying to deal with the trauma that you are undergoing, and that trauma is showing up inside the brain, and it is affecting how you are functioning. It doesn't mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or that you have a brain disease. You do not need a medical label to validate your story. What you need is your story to be heard and you to be validated as a whole human being going through something. You see, it's not about you, it's about you in the world. An environment affects us. What people are saying and doing around us affect us. And we absorb that, we process that through our mind. Our mind is this phenomenal filter that filters life. And each and every single one of us is doing that 24/7. During the day, you are filtering the experiences of life into your brain as physical structural changes inside of your brain and as changes in your DNA. Your brain and body collectively are made of 37 to 100 trillion cells. And at this moment, as I'm speaking, it is your mind which is processing the electromagnetic sound waves that I'm generating and the auditory sound waves. You are processing that on a psychological level. You are thinking, feeling, and choosing about what I'm saying. And you are doing this at about 400 billion actions per second. And you are converting this into your brain. You're pushing it into your brain. And as this mind energy hits the brain, there is a reaction. The brain responds on a neurochemical, electromagnetic, and quantum and genetic level. And you are building my words into your brains right at this moment at 400 billion actions per second into little protein structures. The words that I'm saying are becoming vibrations inside of proteins, and the proteins are accumulating together to grow little branches. And those branches grow into tree-like structures. And these are called thoughts. So what we do every day, all day long, is we build the experiences of life into our brain as thought trees made of proteins. And I'm going to show you some slides in a moment and some props to help you understand this even better. But you do this. It's phenomenal. Then at nighttime, your mind is sorting out the thoughts that you have built during the day, hence dreams and nightmares. Because as our brain and body physically regenerate, so does our mind, and our mind drives the process. So therefore, during the day, we are converting life's experiences through the mind into the brain and body, and into the mind as well. These thoughts go in 3 places: mind, brain, and body. And at nighttime, you're sorting these out, what you've built during the day in preparation for the next day. And this entire process can be self-regulated. We are absolutely brilliant. Each and every one of you sitting here today is a brilliant, phenomenal human being with the most phenomenal brain that is designed and attuned and aligned to your phenomenal mind. Each and every one of us here is hearing the same message, but you are each of you building your own unique designer thought tree in your brain of the content that I'm delivering. Because the thought that you have just built is completely unique. No one has ever seen what I've just said in the way that you've just seen it right now. And that uniqueness is your identity. It's linked into your identity, how you uniquely think, feel, and choose. And then life hits us and our identity can be affected. And when identity is affected, that's when people get suicidal. That's when people lose hope. That's when people start collapsing. And that's when we need to recognize the impact of supporting each other through these situations. So if you're in a situation where you're being abused, maybe in a marriage, or you're in a terrible work environment, or you're abused as a child, and you are manifesting these signals which are also impacting your behaviors, and you get labeled and diagnosed and stuck in a box, your story hasn't been heard. You've been given an empty gift. Because initially to have a name attached to how you feel is very comforting. But it's an empty gift, because if you open it, now what? What does this mean? So you've got bipolar depression, or you're clinically depressed, or and then they'll say, why do you have that label? Because you have those symptoms. Why do you have those symptoms? Because you have clinical depression. Why? Can you see? It's called a tautology. It doesn't tell you your story. In fact, it overlooks your story completely. While we look at emotional warning signals, as if you look at an emotion as an illness, then you're going to get stuck in a diagnosis. And a diagnosis is very limiting. Labels and diagnoses are very limiting. 100% of humans are battling with mental health, as I've been describing, in different ways at different stages of your life. Only 3% of leaders are talking about mental health. And only 4% of churches, for example, are talking about mental health. And that's crazy, because it kind of implies that, only 4% or 3% of people are battling, 97% aren't. Absolutely wrong. 100% of people are battling in different ways to different extremes at different stages of their life. To be human is to battle. And to be human is to process through that battle and to repair it and to grow. And that's how we grow as humans. So therefore, we should be embracing warning signals like depression and anxiety and the panic attack behaviors and all these things, because they are messengers. They are not your enemy. They are your friend. So before I go into more about that, I'm going to show you some slides. And the first slide is we're going to talk about how to clean up your mental mess. I've got lots of materials, and I'm talking from my most recent book at the moment called Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. And I have an app that goes with this as well. So how to clean up your mental mess. What happens to you does not have to be the same as what happens in you. So everything, as I've said, is built by your mind into your brain. Your mind shows up in your brain and your body. Your brain is going to respond to your mind, as does your body respond to your mind. So if your mind is a mess, it puts a mess in your brain. The response is a mess, and the response in our body is a mess. Now, we can handle that to a certain extent. Our brains and bodies are wired in such a way, scientists call it being wired for love. We are wired for survival. And part of survival is experimenting through the unexpected. As I mentioned already, you can't control the events and circumstances of life, but you can control your reactions and turn them into responses. So there is room in our neurobiology for making a mess. So here's the first really good piece of news to share with you tonight. It's okay to be a mess. Tell yourself it's okay to be a mess. The whole point of the mess is to self-regulate it so that you can repair and grow from the mess. What would be an example of a mess? Maybe someone says something to you when you wake up in the morning and you snap at them and you get like really irritable and shout at them or something. That's a mess. Now you feel guilty because maybe you're the parent or the husband or the wife or whatever, or it's a business colleague. So you don't suppress it because it's happened. What you do is you own it, you embrace it. Say, okay, I did that. There's a reason why I did that. You see, in understanding the wired for love nature of the brain and the body and the mind, we see that we have this optimism bias. We see that we are drawn to the messes, not because we are evil or bad or have that design, because we are drawn to the mess to fix them. Because when you repair a mess, that is when you can become healthy again. So this is the whole way that the immune system works. Whenever there's a threat to the body, the immune system will come in and try and help you fix up the mess. So when we associate this with illness, we understand this. But did you ever associate this with a thought? A thought is as real as an illness, is as real as physical damage in your brain and your body. Thoughts are real things. You are building real protein trees in your brain as I'm speaking. And initially they can be messy. We have accommodation in our design for messiness. But we don't have accommodation in our brain or psychoneurobiology for the mind-brain-body connection for staying in the mess. We have to be kind and generous to ourselves to own that and to fix it. But you have to come from this premise. And the premise is you are phenomenal. You are wired for love. You are wired for survival. And therefore, the way you are showing up in your day-to-day life and the way that you are showing up in the traumatic times of the extreme trauma times of your life is not who you are. It is because of. In my most recent clinical trial, which I talk about in the book, and I'm going to show you some slides as well as we move along, I had some of my subjects that initially when we looked at neuroscientific principles like using the QEEG, we looked at blood, we looked at the psychology, we looked at neuropsychology stuff, we looked at the most important thing we looked at was the person's narrative. In other words, we looked at all the different psychoneurobiological components, a very intensive study. And what we found was at the beginning of the study, a lot of the subjects were saying things like, I am depression. They had identified, now you can't be depression because depression is not a noun. Depression is an experience. It is an emotional warning signal. It is your non-conscious mind which works 24/7, driving your conscious mind, which is only awake when you're awake, working with your physical body. So your non-conscious mind, which is doing all this work, it's the most brilliant part of you, is working with your conscious mind, with your brain, with your body, to help you to recognize when you're in a mess. Why? Because it's threatening your survival. So what must you do? You must repair it. Okay, and this is self-regulation under the concept of mind management. So when I talk about mind management, it is being able to tune into these signals that are coming collectively from the mind, brain, and body, telling you that you're messy. So instead of running from the mess of your life, you run into the mess because in it is the message of why you are like this. As our subjects went through the clinical trial, and this is what I found over the years of being a therapist as well, and in the work I've done, all the subsequent work I've done, is that once you start saying, okay, I see this mess, I embrace the mess in order to process and reconceptualize it and find the root cause, because this is not who I am showing up like this because of. That is when the shift happens. I even had some of my subjects in the most recent clinical trial. This was commonly happened throughout therapy as well. My therapy years in clinical practice was that some of the subjects said, went from I am depression to I am not depression, I am depressed because of, and I'm even more depressed. But it's different. It's a different depression. I'm depressed now because I'm seeing why I was caught in a cycle of not being able to function. So you're seeing, for example, the abuse that maybe you suffered as a child that you've suppressed maybe for 20 years, and how because nothing can be suppressed forever, it will come up. Thoughts are real things. They're volcanic in nature. So once you see the pain of the reason why you are functioning like you are, that can be very, very, very hard to deal with. So that's part of the healing process. Things get worse before they get better. It is called the treatment effect. But what I showed in my research is that your brain is changing all the time. And as you drive it with complete honesty, as you embrace your behaviors and your emotions and your perspective and your body symptoms to find out what the thought is that is the root cause, taking you down to your processing and the root cause, as you go through that process, you are getting control back. You are bringing those thoughts from the non-conscious to the conscious. And as soon as you do that, those thoughts in your brain that are made of proteins become weakened. You see, what we see from neuroscience is that as soon as you're aware, those thoughts that are driving your behaviors, that are these patterns that are disruptive to your life or destructive to your life, those are coming from a thought pattern. And that thought pattern was a coping mechanism because of. And as soon as you start seeing that, we see from neuroscience that those thought trees become weaker. They become weakened. And when something's weakened, it can be changed. In science, neuroscience, we talk about the concept of these little thought trees becoming malleable, changeable. So you can drive it. Now, you can't change what's happened to you, but you can change what's in you. And you can change how that plays out into your future. So someone who's been abused repeatedly as a child and suppressed that and saw themselves, and I use sexual abuse as an example because it's such a powerful example, that so often the suppression comes because it's so painful and so distorted. The whole experience is distorted, so therefore the view of oneself becomes distorted. And one suppresses, and that very often it's suppressed, and when one does eventually face it, it is destructive. But while you're in the process of suppression, which is a coping mechanism that's not sustainable, but it's one we go into, and it falls under the different trauma responses, which are fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. Okay, but once you start seeing that and you start opening up and you start finding what's happening there, your behaviors are going to change, and they're not all going to be great behaviors, but you are starting to get control back. So therapy and embracing and facing the past and working with your mind, managing your mind, is not an easy process. So what I've done over the years is I didn't want my patients to just be reliant on me. I wanted my patients to become able to be reliant on themselves. So important. So please, therapy, counseling, coaching is vitally important as part of the healing process. But you live with yourself 24/7. You wake up in the middle of the night with that panic attack. You sitting in that meeting and your stomach is in a knot. You're in a situation and you get triggered. In other words, you are living with yourself 24/7. How are you managing your minds in those moments? Do you have an ability to manage your mind? Absolutely. We see from neuroscience that you can self-regulate, which is basically mind management, every 10 seconds. We are able to monitor how we are functioning every 10 seconds. I mean, just experience this right now. As I say this, be aware of yourself right now. How are you sitting? What are you doing with your hands? What's your facial expression? What are you thinking of? What is your... Just try that. When you have a conversation with someone, when you go from here, look at yourself speaking those words. What's your body language? What's your facial expression? What is the impact of your words on that person? How are they responding to you? Just do a few exercises like that and watch how you are actually very able to consciously and deliberately and intentionally monitor how you are functioning. And you may be thinking, how on earth do I do that all day long? Well, according to neuroscientific research, this is what humans are designed for. We're designed to monitor ourselves. And that's how we manage our mess, is to get into these processes. So I wanted to know how I could do this. How could I help my patients deal with the severe -10, -8, -9 traumas? How could I help just all of us, including myself, deal with the -4, +4 day-to-day life in the bell curve? How do I keep myself in a state of embracing those emotions and seeing them not as a problem? How do I, when I do something that hurts someone else, instead of falling apart with guilt and trying to shove it down and defend myself and justify, how do I truly and honestly step into wisdom, my wise mind, and work with my messy mind in order to manage that process? And that's what I have looked at over these 38 years. And I developed what I call an Amazon of the mind. As we know, Amazon, you can deliver anything, anywhere, anytime. It works. The system's brilliant. It works. Whether you like Amazon or not, the system works. Okay? So I developed a system called the neurocycle, which is not a technique. It's not a therapeutic technique. Anyone can use it at any age. I have trained kids as young as 3 to use this. Okay? It is a system that helps you to get yourself into that self-regulated state, that you can observe how you are functioning, and you can look at the patterns in your life, and the moment-by-moment, day-to-day patterns of how you're responding in the moment. So let's say you're totally happy and you're in that meeting and someone yells at you and you freak out and now you can't think straight. How do you get yourself back under control so that you can still run that meeting like it should be run? To the big stuff, to the patterns in your life where you see that your creativity is dropping, that you're feeling burnt out, that you're more irritable than normal, whatever. How do you, because when there's a pattern, a consistent, persistent pattern in your life, there is a cause, because that is not who you are. You are amazing. You are phenomenal. There is something you can do that no one else can do. And I'm not just saying that. I'm not a motivational speaker. I'm a scientist. And I have seen this with the thousands of patients that I have worked with, and the thousands of hours I've spent doing research, and the millions of people that we now reach through my global platform, the kind of feedback that we get. When you recognize your identity and you recognize the core of who you are, it makes you humble, but it also makes you sense that, hey, I can do this. I can get through this. I worked a lot with suicidal patients, those that have had suicidal thoughts, those who attempted suicide, those who have survived suicide, and families of victims of suicide. And I can tell you that that identity, where you don't feel valued, if you don't feel that there's something you can do that no one else can do, that if you don't see the value in your life, that is where hope goes. And then that the hope just disappears, and the pain of not being who you are and not being allowed to be who you are just is overwhelming. And that can come from so many causes. So mental health isn't a few people, it is all of us. And we're reading statistics that there's been a 30% increase in mental health issues over the pandemic. Well, let me tell you a little story. That just what that means is that extreme, that the pandemic has pushed people into those extreme states. So there's been a 30% increase in people going into extreme states. So going down the past the -4, down to the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that is completely normal. It doesn't mean we suddenly have a brain, an epidemic of mental illness starting for no reason. It is completely because of the adverse circumstances and because we're not actually helping each other cope. A very interesting study came out of the pandemic in terms of mental health. Many have come out, and this one is particularly interesting. Both the elderly, and I'm talking about 65 plus, and the 18 to 24 age group suffered severe depression. We find that depression has moved, the extreme states of depression increased in those two age groups more than in other age groups. So everyone was battling with the levels of depression through the pandemic. Everyone is, but the extreme states where you feel debilitated, there was a huge effect in those age groups. And it's not the only age group, but this is what the study has found. And what they found was that the older generation, even though they were more isolated because they weren't as technologically proficient as the younger generation, coped better with the extreme states of depression than the younger generation. The younger generation cope better with the isolation because of their ability to connect technologically wise. So now we ask, why did the older generation actually manage depression better? Because they had context. They have memories. We've been through bad stuff before. But your 18 to 24-year-olds don't have that context. So what do we do as a community? We come together and help each other. You let the old people talk to the young people and tell them about all the things that they've got through. Just the other night, my son was talking about how my 85-year-old mother would tell stories of her in the war. She was in the war, and how she grew up and how she got through that. And he said that those stories had helped him through this time of the pandemic. And so there is an example. And the young people can sit down and help the old people. Like my brother sat with my mom and taught her how to get all her technology. I mean, she's 85 and she's as proficient on technology as what I am. Almost. Okay, she does pretty well. She's incredible. So in other words, we can bring communities together. We don't need to put everyone into expensive therapy. We don't need to make people get fear that, oh, unless you get into therapy, you're not going to heal your mental health. That is not the correct message. The message is, yes, it has increased. Yes, that's a normal increase. It's normal that we go through these depression and anxiety, etc., etc. But what we need to do is come together as a community. I'm busy with another study at the moment that we ran over COVID with 35,000 people, and what we're looking at, and we'll be doing our analyses over December and January, is how people manage their mental health over COVID and the impact of a mind management technique versus not having some kind of mind management technique. Interesting study came out of Tokyo and Texas a couple of years back that backs up the research that I present in my book, Cleaning Up the Mental Mess, which showed that when we embrace our emotions, our pain, our mess, and see them as messengers as opposed to brain illnesses, we actually cope way better. We get through them more effectively. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some slides that I've been promising to show you. So first thing that you'll see is a volcano. And this volcano is so representative of what is going on with these thoughts. Thoughts are real things. So while I show you this image of the volcano, before we press play, so that you, well, mind you can press play, is it moving? Yeah, it's moving. This represents a thought, a toxic thought. This represents a healthy thought. Thoughts look like trees in the brain. You are building healthy ones at the moment. You'll see that this tree is in a pot. It has a root system. So as I began to speak, or you saw from the program, that I was going to speak about mental health. So that was the seed sown in the ground. As I began to speak and give you all this information and the things you're seeing and hearing, you were growing. That's the root system. That is the origin of the thought you are currently building. The branches above the ground are your unique interpretation of what I'm saying. So every single one of you in the room here today have got your own unique design of your above ground branches. Each of these little branches is made of proteins, and the proteins are holding my words. At this point, you've built probably close to 1,000 branches in the root system and in the interpretation. So as you build the root, which is as your mind receives my words, pushes it into the brain, the root forms, and immediately your interpretation, how you perceive the world, how you perceive what I'm saying, grows into these trees. Now this is healthy, and the majority of our experiences, hopefully for most people, are healthy. But when we have a toxic experience like an abuse or something like that, or death of a loved one, or loss of finances, or someone constantly bullying and that kind of stuff, there is the root system. It is also real. As real in the brain, it's also made of proteins. The root now is distorted. The whole experience is distorted. The interpretation is distorted. There's the physical abuse of the child, the interpretation. I'm unworthy. I can't form relationships. I don't deserve anything. I hate myself. That kind of thing, which will then manifests in behaviors and emotions and bodily sensations and a perspective on life. And this perspective may be something like, I am useless, I can't form relationships, I hate myself, life sucks, my body is so sore, I have GI symptoms, or whatever. So in other words, this manifests in how the world sees us. But this is not who we are. This is telling us a story. So if we learn to embrace these, we can then reconceptualize them, deconstruct them, and reconstruct them into these. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't remember the abuse, but I will get to a point in my life where there's enough space around the abuse that I've reconceptualized it to the point where I can talk about it, and I will still cry, but it no longer controls me. I have now changed and reconceptualized how it's going to play out into my future. So the volcano is meant to show you that these are volcanic in nature. These are as real as a COVID virus. These are as real as any virus in your body. They are also made of proteins. And these proteins fold incorrectly, and there's an upset in the electrical chemical balance in the brain. These are literally causing brain damage. And this is why they threaten your survival. So when you have a toxic experience and it builds in as a toxic thought, which it does immediately, and if it's a consistent abuse or something, it becomes stronger and stronger. Whatever you think about and experience the most grows bigger. So some of these are very complex and have been established for many, many years, and that produces very complex behaviors. And some are in the moment situations, so they're not as big, but they're still toxic. They still are setting your mind, brain, and body into an alert mode, and your whole immune system, your whole body, everything about your brain, mind, and body are working towards making you aware. How do they grab your attention? Before they do that, let's quickly have a look again at the volcano. These are volcanic. You cannot suppress it. They're alive, they're living, they're real, and they will explode volcanic mode if you don't deal with them. And when they do explode volcanic mode, and eventually we maybe do deal with them or we don't deal with them, things get worse. If we don't deal with them, the volcano keeps exploding, and then for a time it's dormant, and then it explodes again. Until we get to the root, the volcano will not stop exploding. A bit like in a garden of weeds. You can't chop off the head, it will keep growing back. You have to uproot the weed, and that takes time. And part of my research has been to look at how long does it take, what are the cycles that the mind and the brain and the body need to go through time-wise in order to find these and to break them down and to reconstruct them. And what I found is that it's definitely not 21. You know, you hear so much about it takes 21 days to build a habit. It does not take 21 days to build a habit. Major changes happen at 21 days, but it takes 60 days or 63-day cycles, 9-week cycles. The brain and body and mind work in cycles of 3 weeks. And so you need at least 3 cycles of 21 for any kind of decent reconceptualization to start happening. So let's say, for example, I bring up a case of a patient who was abused for many years and had went through 2 years of therapy. In other words, multiple 63-day cycles over those 2 years working on that issue. And in the first 63-day cycles, only an element of the root is the cause, the origin story, what happened, was manifested. So at the end of that time period of the first cycle, there was a realization that I'm like this because of something going on. Another cycle took them even deeper into the causes and the other areas, and so on and so on and so on. So there's no cookie cutter. You do one cycle for this and one cycle for that. It is completely unique and up to the individual's pain that they are going through and the level of complexity of the trauma, the uniqueness of the person. What is fixed is these amounts of 63 days. So what I found from my research is that for the mind to actually physically create neural pathway changes inside the brain, you need time for the proteins to be broken down and rebuilt. Energy is never lost. Energy is always converted. So it takes time to take the energy from the toxicity and to convert that over into the story that you want for your life. How many people in therapy and who are dealing with their stuff, or maybe not even in therapy, coaching, counseling, whatever, maybe you're in that or you're not in that, but how many times have you found yourself saying, I know that's what I can do. So there's the story, there's the green tree, but you're stuck over here and it feels like there's this chasm between who you are functioning as now and what you know you should be. You know that that's the right way to function. You know that that's the truth about yourself, but you're still stuck in this place where you still see yourself as useless and not worthy of a relationship and someone's always leaving you or something like that. And to cross that chasm, to get to the point where this is not controlling you, takes time. And this is very often what happens with people with healing. They don't go through the right amount of time. So you know the goal, you know where you instinctively, because of your wise mind, know where you want to go, but then you don't get there because of time. So I go into this in a lot of depth in my book as well. So I just wanted to touch on that this is not a quick and easy fix. If you want a quick 5 steps to fixing your mind, you've come to the wrong place. Mind work is a lifelong process. We have to self-regulate and mind manage constantly. Once we start reconstructing, deconstructing and reconstructing over these cycles of 63 days, what we do, and this is the volcano analogy, what will happen is when a volcano is basically finished erupting and the lava cools off and basically gets absorbed into the ground, the soil becomes more enriched than it was before, as I'm sure you know, and the grass that grows over is even greener than before. This happens to be a volcano in Iceland, and I saw this and drove over this when it was not erupted, and it was a beautiful green field, and there was the tour guide was telling us, there is a volcano we are driving over, it could erupt any minute, and he literally said, any minute. He said, don't worry, there's one highway, we'll get away in time. And one highway, there literally is one highway in Iceland. We were driving on over this volcano. This is 3-4 years later, and my son was there, and this is the video. He actually videoed this erupting volcano that I drove over a few years before. In a few months' time, that volcano will be green fields again. So this is what happens when we deconstruct and reconstruct. We still remember there was a volcano, but eventually over time, that grief doesn't change, but your space around the grief grows. And that's what's very important. When we talk about reconstructing, we're not taking away your story. You never want to take away your story, but you do want the space around it to grow. You do want it to change into how it works out, how it plays out into your future. If you look at the next slide, it's just basically a summary of the fact that mental health is not a disease, that we've got to stop talking about it as a disease. This has been a huge problem. I talk about in my book a study that was done, that started in 1996 and culminated in 2014 and 15 and is still going on. And it is a study that, massive federal data that show that something that we're not being told much about. That's why I speak about this and why I put this in my books. And this is what this research showed. It showed that a trend was starting to be observed between 1996, and that trend was changing. And what that trend was, that the trend of people living longer, because of the advances in medicine and technology, people were living longer. We all agree with that. We all know that. But that trend, which had been a decades-long trend, was starting to reverse. By 2014, it was confirmed that people are not living longer than they used to, but certain age groups are dying younger, 8 to 25 years younger. And those with a label and a diagnosis in mental health, you can pretty much are in the 25 years dying younger age range. Our Gen Z are going to die 20 to 25 years younger than my mom's generation and my generation. They don't have to, but the way we are handling mental health, that is what's happening. We are seeing that adolescent boys that are so medicated, there's been a drop-off of them going into university. So there are impacts, and I can go on for hours, and I talk about it more in the book. The point is that people are dying 8 to 25 years younger, and this is not even before, this is before the pandemic hit. Okay, and that's added on chopped off another 2 years, more or less, of people's lifespans if we don't manage our mental health. The point being is that people are dying 8 to 25 years younger from preventable lifestyle issues. What we have neglected over the last 30 years, and it's a trend that I have watched with absolute trepidation and concern, which is what's driven me to do the research I do and talk about what I do, is this focus on the physical. Now, we need the advance in neuroscience. I'm a neuroscientist. I love the advances in brain science. But that doesn't mean that the brain controls me. You are not your brain. You are not a victim of your biology. You're a victor over and above your biology. Your brain and body are designed to work for you, not against you. And when we understand those principles, which coming to a conference like this, so many of these principles are being spoken about, it is so important to understand the natural pharmacopoeia of your body. But it's so much more important to also understand the role of the mind. It's not about only the physical. It is about the mind driving the physical. You can have two people, and I'll give you an example of a friend of mine who's an endocrinologist who sits with people that are extremely ill and dying and who are not as ill. And she said that depending on the state of mind will influence the outcome of that person's health. Now, there's thousands of studies like that. I've done studies in this field that link between psychoneurobiology. The mind-brain-body connection is very well established. It's got 150 years of research behind it, and even more now. But that's still not totally in our heads. We've got to get that. We've got to recognize that you cannot neglect the mind in pursuit of the physical. We have to bring it all together because we are holistic we need to be holistic in our approaches. Your mind drives how well your body digests the food that you've just eaten. I don't know if you're aware of that, but your mind is driving your body in terms of your digestion. So, for example, if you're in sitting down and you're totally anxious and you're sitting down to a meal and you're worked up and you're angry with someone and you're mad and you're eating, in that moment, many things will go wrong. 1,400 neurophysiological responses will start working against you and not for you. So while you're eating that food, just on the digestive level, your pancreas will stop secreting the 20 different neuropeptides that are required for you to digest the food. And if that happens, the rest of the digestive system is going to be messed up, and you're going to wonder, why do I have such a stomach cramp after eating? So if you're emotional and worked up, don't eat. Calm down first, because your mind is driving the effectiveness of your entire digestive system. There's a lot of emphasis on the gut-brain connection and the enteric nervous system and all that stuff, but that's driven by the mind. So we need to understand that. Another thing, if you're totally worked up and you're not managing your mind, you're staying in the mess. Another one of the 1,400 plus neurophysiological responses that can go wrong is in your heart. So the blood vessels around your heart, if you are shifting from healthy stress to toxic stress, will start contracting. Let me back up for a few moments and talk about stress, toxic and healthy stress. So basically, when we are experiencing life, our signals of our brain, mind, and body, which we will also talk about in a moment, are going to alert us. And those work together to alert us. And immediately your neurophysiology goes into a state of stress. And stress is very good for you. Stress gets everything in a state where you can have wisdom with enough oxygen and blood flow into your brain. So for example, your blood vessels around your heart will dilate. And that will push more blood flow and oxygen and nutrients and so on to the front of your brain, which is what you need to make a wise decision in that moment. But if you respond in a messy way and you don't manage the mess and you don't start reading the red flags, and I'm going to tell you what they are, the red flags, you are going to shift from healthy stress to toxic stress. And toxic stress, 1,400 neurophysiological responses will work against you instead of for you. One of them I mentioned already, the pancreas and the neuropeptides being secreted. The other one is, let's talk about the heart. Now, instead of the blood vessels dilating, they will constrict. And when those blood vessels constrict around your heart, there will be less blood flow and less oxygen in your brain and less nutrients in the brain. And the front part of the brain becomes very active in response to deep thinking. It also becomes very active in a chaotic way in response to messy thinking that is unmanaged. We will see, and we saw this in my research, and I have images of that too. Can you bring up the brain scan of the red brain? I'll show you of using QEEG technology, which is an electrophysiological way of looking inside the brain. It's very accurate in terms of looking at a person's thinking response in the brain in terms of energy frequencies in real time. And so when we are, what you're seeing there is, these are called head maps. The top is the nose, the side is the ears, and we're looking at this over time. This is a subject in the control group of my most recent clinical trial. And essentially, when people are in a state of high anxiety, unmanaged mental mess, and they're not reading the anxiety as a signal, but they're running with the anxiety, so the anxiety is just increasing, then, and that, coming along with that are all the other emotions. Anxiety is not its own emotion, it's got a lot of other emotions with it. When that happens, we're going to have an asymmetry between the two front parts in the frontal lobe. So the energy flow is going to flow in a crazy way. It's like a tsunami in the brain. So we see that with the increased redness inside the brain. In those specific areas, you'll see the last two ones over there, we get too much of what we call high beta activity in the brain. Now the different frequencies of the brain are delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, high beta, and high gamma. And they flow like waves in the sea. So when we're in our -4+4 state, it's like the sea. Big waves, deep out, then they get a little bit not as, the huge swells, and they get a little bit less swelly, and then they go to the front of the beach and they build into a high wave with a white crest, crash on the beach, little waves, suck back in, and the whole thing repeats itself. That's what we basically go through moment by moment. We want that kind of energy pattern across the left and the right side of the brain in a coherent way. But when we are in a messy state that's unmanaged, that coherence starts dropping off, and we get asymmetry. Too much activity in one side, not enough in another, or just a tsunami of activity. So what we're seeing down the bottom there at day 63, we see what we call a red brain, and that's someone who's got a tsunami. All the energy frequencies are flowing in the wrong way, and there's very little blood flow and oxygen at the front of the brain. The heart's in severe challenging state, cardiovascular issues, neurological issues, etc., etc. So essentially, this is someone in the control group, and as they went through the study, all the different testing that we did, psychological, narrative, blood work, DNA, I also looked at telomeres, DNA, etc., they were being made very aware of their issues, but they weren't given a mind management technique. At the end of the 9 weeks, they were given it, so we sorted this out. But let's have a look at someone who was in the control group, and they were doing mind management. You'll see a subject who was extremely depressed, who had had many labels, who has pretty much given up on life. This was a last resort, was persuaded by friends to come into the trial, and this happened to land up in the experimental group. And this particular subject has a blue brain at day 1. And a blue brain means that there's very low energy, that everything is like flatline. We don't want flatline, we don't want tsunami, we want something in between. And so what we see there is flatline. And this person was saying things like, I am depression, and just listing off all the terrible things about life. There was just no hope, and not sleeping, and all kinds of things. This person got the mind management system, not therapy from me. I've developed an app called the Neurocycle app. It was loaded on their phone. It was double blind, so I had a team on the ground. I didn't know, it was all randomized, controlled by research company, team on the ground. But so there was another person who basically put the app in the phone, showed them how to use the system of the Neurocycle that I've developed, and they went back home, and they did it for 21 days daily, came back into clinic at day 21 and retested all the different things, and there you'll see the brain has gone gray. So what does that mean? The gray means that, and everyone has different shades of gray, and I'm not talking about the TV show. Okay, I'm talking about that you see one color gray there, but there's no one pattern because everyone's unique. So you can't say, oh, a gray brain's a normal brain. What we're seeing is that when we see gray, we're seeing that balance of energy. And for your balance of energy may be completely different to mine, but it's where you're feeling peace in the midst of chaos. I just want to stress that. Okay, so I'm not treating this like a biomarker. I'm treating this as evidence of change in the brain. That's how we should use any kind of brain technology, not as your brain made you do it. This pattern means this. It is more your brain is responding in this way, and on average we're looking for these kind of patterns of responses. But what's important is to hear the person's narrative along with that brain response, and to look at biomarkers in the blood, and to look at telomeres, which tell you about your biological age. And this particular subject at day 1, their telomeres, which are the ends of chromosomes, they basically were in their mid-30s, and they had a biological age of a sickly 65-year-old, which meant that cardiovascularly, neurologically, immune function, everything was down. Their homocysteine levels, a lot of inflammation, very bad DHEA cortisol ratios. In other words, this was a very sick person, a person that was an accident waiting to happen, literally, in their body, very, very vulnerable. And this is what happens if we don't manage our mind. You're not going to just have a toxic thought and get sick. It's not quite that way. It accumulates over time. So as we don't manage our mind, so things accumulate, and so the vulnerability of the body increases. This poor young woman was very abused as a child, never had an opportunity to process. So cumulatively over the years, it just wore her body out. And so essentially at the end of, by day 21, instead of this person saying, I am depression, this person went on to say, I am depressed because of massive shift. No longer did this person's identity was a shot. If you see the top row, there's no green at the front of the brain where the nose is at the top. We see blue, which means very often what we see from these studies using QEEG, when someone's identity is shot, and we tell that from the narrative as well as psychological testing and so on, there we'll see a lot of low energy at the front of the brain, a lot of poor executive decisions, not good cognitive functioning, etc., and a very poor self-identity. By day 21, we see green coming in the front of the brain. That's shifted. That person's identity is coming back, and we saw that in the narrative. By day 63, 9 weeks later, this particular subject their brain had stabilized even more. The gray, we want to see gray in the brain. We want to see lots of gray with those peaks of green, and maybe little spurts of red up. Because from moment by moment, if I had to do a QEEG on you during the course of a day, we're going to see gray, we're going to see bits of red and a bit more gray and a bit of blue. You're going to go up and down, so you take it on average. So on average, we want to see how a person is managing their brain. And what this person said is, I'm not not scared of depression anymore. I'm not scared of anxiety, because anxiety and depression are warning signals. So this person learned how to manage the red flags that would convert you from toxic stress healthy stress to toxic stress. So what are the red flags? Your emotional warning signals. So there's 4 warning signals. Red flags are warning signals, okay? And the first one is your emotion. So any emotion should be embraced. Never talk about an emotion as being a bad thing, even if it is something like anxiety, even if it is something like severe depression, even if it is something like terror. None of those are bad. They are all messengers. They are all warning signals. So when your kids come to you with fear, it's not that there's bad or there's terror or whatever, or your husband or wife or friend, never see those as bad. See them as messengers, because that's not who the person is. It's how they're showing up. It's a coping mechanism. It's the body, brain, and mind working together to say, okay, come, let's sort this mess out. So first red flag is the emotional warning signal. Then the second red flag is what is going on in your behaviors. What are the patterns that are different? Maybe your child has changed and they suddenly don't want to go to that favorite gym that they used to go to, or that favorite sport, or they're suddenly going in their room when they come home from school and they don't want to connect. Or what is your pattern? Is your creativity dropping off? Are you feeling more like waking up exhausted and just like whatever? What are the patterns, the behavioral patterns? That's not who you are. That is because of something. So that's the second red flag. Third red flag is your body. What is your body telling you? What is your physiology telling you? That particular subject that you saw, the blue brain, at the end of 9 weeks, her biological age matched her chronological age. In 9 weeks, her body went from being a 65-year-old body to a 35-year-old body. That is miraculous. We didn't think telomeres could change in a short. Normally, we think it's been predicted that changes happen over 5 years. I showed in my research over periods of 9 weeks of mind management. We didn't address diet or exercise; those are massive factors. But this study didn't look at those. This study looked at mind management, and that mind management changed the biological age, the health of every cell of her body, which meant that the mind was actually influencing the brain structures and every cell of the body. At 6 months, this person was very stable, the same kind of pattern happening. This person was looking at the red flags, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. And not scared of, I'm going to have depression, I'm going to have anxiety, it's normal, and some days it's going to be worse than others, but I know what to do. I can manage it. So body signals, GI symptoms, heart palpitations, adrenaline rushes, maybe cramps in your legs. I don't know. It's all different. What are the changes in your body? And then perspective, mindset, attitude towards life. That's the fourth warning signal, which is a red flag that you need to pay attention to. Because those 4 warning signals, perspective being something like life sucks, or I can't do this, or everyone's always leaving me, or I hate it, or I can't do this, it's too much. Is that your perspective? Because those are, look at them, stand back and look at them with an objective, clinical, kind, gentle, loving voice. And say, okay, this is not me. These red flags are showing that there's something going on. Let me now do the work. Let me give myself permission to sit down every day for 15 to 45 minutes. That's how long those subjects spend. That's how long I would work with my patients in therapy. That's what they would do at home. 15 to 45-minute sessions where you sit in cycles of 63 days, where you then work through the 5 steps of the neurocycle to start deconstructing. So you start by, at the top, from your red flags, your warning signals, you'll then start getting a glimpse into the thought, which then brings it into your conscious awareness from the non-conscious mind, and now it's becoming malleable. And now you can start shifting. So each day, you're going to get a little bit more glimpse. You're not going to fix it on day 1. It's going to take a full 21 days of 15 to 45 minutes, and maybe a bit longer, to start seeing what's going on at the roots. It's almost like you're taking a spade and you're digging around the tree. I would tell my patients to put 2 chairs out and sit in one when you do this, and you in the other one too. This one is the wise mind and that one is the messy mind. And you very gently and kindly saying, okay, let's work together on this. It's okay. This is not who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. We're going to find out why. And that's the kind of language that you want to give yourself. I have a podcast called Cleaning Up the Mental Mess. It's one of the top globally in mental health, because I teach you these practical things, because I give you a lot of insights. I'm telling you a lot now. So if you want to learn more, there's the materials, there's the app, there's the podcast, where I explain these things that I'm trying to give you as much as I can in a short period of time. But I walk you through different things of how to help yourself through these signals and work your way through managing this process. From day 23 to 63, which is another 42 days, you only have to spend about 5 minutes. So you do the 5 steps in 5 minutes, as opposed to, so the first 3 weeks you're spending around 15 to 45 minutes. And you're working on one thought. And you might think, but I don't just think one thought. A thought is a tree. What are trees made of? Roots and branches. Do you agree that trees are made of lots of roots and lots of branches? That means that every thought has lots of roots and lots of branches. Those are memories. So thoughts are not the same thing as memories. Like a tree is made of roots and branches, a thought is made of root memories and branch memories. So when I say work on one thought, which is that pattern that you picked up from those signals, those red flags, and the thought is that I'm just not creative anymore. That may be the name of the tree. Like you get an apple tree. Like you get, I'm not creative anymore tree. But as you start going through the 5 steps daily of the neurocycle, you start seeing all the memories, all the details, and it's a lot of information. One thought tree can have thousands of these memories. And that's what you deal with daily. That's why you do a little bit every day. This is hard work. It's overwhelming. Mind work is overwhelming. That's why I say 15 to 45 minutes. Cap it at that. Don't do it all day long. It'll exhaust you. But what does happen is as you learn to do those 5 steps of the neurocycle, which is the scientific way that you drive the neuroplasticity of your brain using your wise mind. So it's your wise mind getting the messy mind under control and driving the neuroplasticity and genetic changes inside your brain and your body. As you do this process in a deliberate and intentional fashion daily, you then learn the system. So you find yourself neurocycling in those moment-by-moment things. So you do the daily stuff for the big stuff. But in the moment-by-moment, when you have someone getting irritated with you in a meeting, or one of your employees doing something crazy, or one of your kids doing something crazy, or whatever, and you've just got to deal with these things in the moment. Instead of reacting, which is not going to work for you, reacting puts your body into the 1400 neurophysiological responses that are going to go against you instead of for you, etc. Your wisdom goes, your frontal lobe doesn't get enough oxygen, blah, blah, blah. Instead of that, do a neurocycle. You can do it in 5 seconds. In 1 minute, you do the 5 steps to get yourself back under control, to get your neurochemistry under control. There's a lot more to this, as you can imagine, but that's the basic principle. So I'm going to close off with this slide that you see popping up over there. And this is, the lights should be dim, but anyway, I hope you can see it. This is not from my lab. This is from, it's a very famous, from the glass, called the glass brain. I've forgotten the name of the lab. It'll come back in a moment. But anyway, what you're looking at there is this is incredibly advanced brain technology. It's a combination of different types of technology, and it's linked up to an alive person. And I stress an alive person because if you're dead, there's no firing. So what you're looking at there is basically what's happening in your brains right at this moment. As you're listening to me, you are responding to my words, which are auditory sound waves, electromagnetic light waves from all the stimulation that I'm giving you. Your mind is grabbing that and putting it in your brain. Your brain is responding on an energetic level, chemical level, quantum level, etc. And so basically, let's go back to the glass brain, Mac. We'll explain those in a minute. Okay, so it's responding by that firing. Every single person's pattern in their brain in this room tonight, it's different. It's not the same pattern because you're all thinking and your interpretation, this stuff above the ground, of what I'm saying is different. But that firing is your brain responding. That is your mind showing up in your brain. And you can manage that. And the way to manage that, as I said, is through mind management, through the self-regulation. Look at the next slide. I'm going to show you one more, a couple more, 2 more. Let's go back to that glial cells. Okay, these are actual thought trees in the brain. So this is why I use the analogy of trees. As neuroscientists, we talk about the thought trees as having an arbor-like structure, garden-like structure. And that's what they look like. The ones that are darker, there's more branches. So the more you think about something, the more branches you grow, the more data there is. The more memories there are in that tree. Memory is data. It's emotions, it's what happened, it's the details, it's how you felt, it's all the stuff around your thinking, feeling, and choosing goes into those. Okay? The experience is the root, and then the branches are your interpretation. Okay, so this now is a very slow down effect of what you're doing in your brain now as well. So you saw the firing. Now here is looking at the neurons actually growing little dendrites, growing these protein branches. So this is what you're doing as I'm talking. You're taking the words. If you were dead, there'd be no movement, no growth. The growth is you driving neuroplasticity, mind building the experience into the brain in these tree-like structures. Now, this happens whether it's a good or a bad experience, whether you're managing the mess or not. But if you don't manage the mess, it becomes very messy, and you build these trees. That's why I use the toxic tree as the analogy. But you can change that. You can't change what's happened to you, but you can change what's in you. Thank you so much.